Hello, and welcome to the As Yet Unnamed History Podcast, the podcast where two, this time three, former history students try and justify their academic choices. My name's Cain, and I was told that I sounded like I was on the verge of crying last episode, so I decided to take the helm this time to see if being forced into a leadership position can approximate charisma. I'm joined by my co-host Ryan. Say hi, Ryan.
Hello out there.
And joining us as a guest is a good friend of both of us, Zachary.
I am here to speak, but not be perceived.
You certainly are.
Oh God, what have we gotten ourselves into?
Now, unfortunately, we will not be continuing our epic tale of the rise and fall of the Greek leagues this episode because there's a bit of a historical emergency in the wider world. Rather, we'll be discussing something far more exciting tonight: historiography and pedagogy. Specifically, the White House released their 1776 commission report, and we figured that there'd be no better way to spend a Friday evening than discussing, for your benefit, the history of historiography, especially in the past 40 years, the role of history in society, and how it should be taught. Wouldn't you agree? No, that's a terrible way to say that.
Well, I mean, this certainly is for the listeners' benefits because it's sure as shit wasn't for ours. This is one of the most painful things I've had to sit through. And yes, I sat through it. I did not read it. I merely let the words leap off the page and be rammed down my gullet so I could eat them as the baby bird that this paper thought I was.
Honestly, as it was intended to be consumed. Yeah, this certainly was a labor of, well, I can't say love, but
the person writing this clearly,
masochism.
Yeah, they had intentions, but I believe you want to get into that later.
Yeah. So yeah, we decided we were going to discuss this tonight. I actually have nothing else scripted here. I'm supposed to just jump into this. I'm supposed to know what I'm talking about. This is too much responsibility. Why did I agree to this? Do I sound like I'm crying?
No, you're not crying yet. You're not crying yet.
So we're going to discuss this with a bit of a softball question to start. The text is pretty explicit, pretty upfront with what its goals are. They're mentioned in the first page. This is probably one of the easiest find, if not necessarily clearly enumerated points they have. But these are the goals as stated: to, quote, enable a rising generation to understand the history and principles of the founding of the United States in 1776, and to strive to form a more perfect union. Further on, they say, this requires a restoration of American education, which can only be grounded on a history of those principles that is, and they quote someone here without saying who that person is, that is accurate, honest, unifying, inspiring, and ennobling, unquote. And a rediscovery of our shared identity rooted in our founding principles is the path to a renewed American unity and a confident American future. Now, that wasn't me reading poorly. That is the text as written. It is, I think they were lacking an editor on their team, if I'm going to be completely honest.
Yeah, from the history super team that you guys were describing before that wrote this masterwork delivered by the gods themselves, I noticed there was no editor. Now, I got to know, real quick, I've been saving this question for when we were recording. How many times did you guys have to read that first bit to really think you understand what they were saying?
That first page was rough, and it wasn't even necessarily trying to understand what they were saying. I just kept getting exhausted. I think I read the first page a good 10 or 20 times without being like, what were the words? What did they say? Something about the Declaration of Independence. And I'd go through it again and I'd leave just completely drained and be like, and then more apprehensive about going back to it because I knew I'd have to do it again.
You have to expend more energy. Zach, how about for you?
I'm very old-fashioned. I went through this document, like a hard copy of it, and I was taking notes throughout the course. And the first page has probably the most annotations or close to the most annotations of any page in the entire document, which is surprising because there's not really any like factual content to fact check, which is what a lot of my notes were throughout this piece, although using the word piece is perhaps being a bit generous for all that it has put me through. But really, there's just so much here that's happening grammatically rather poorly, conceptually. It is it's enjoyable in a very masochistic way. It's enjoyable in the same way, right, that an 18-wheeler going off a cliff is. It's just, it's bad, but you cannot take your eyes off of it.
So would you? I know you're a huge fan of what I'm about to say, and I want to get your opinion on this one. Is it as good as The Room?
Oh.
There's a lot of similarities in the script between the script and The Room here.
There are a similar amount of plot holes, a lack of consistency and overall direction. I'm gonna have to hand it to The Room. I have experienced The Room more often, and The Room has brought people together. It has achieved more unity than this document, despite the fact that unity is one of its purported aims. So I will have to give it to The Room, but I will note that it gives off the same vibe, but it's on the complete opposite end of the spectrum in terms of enjoyment.
Right. So having read those goals explicitly, and I can do it again if you want. That's not a threat. What do you think of those goals, and what do you guys think are maybe more of the implicit goals that can be found in this text?
If you don't mind me taking this one off the bat, I think it might be a good idea to explain exactly what this document is and why it was released before we go deeper into it.
Fair enough. I thought I was supposed to be leading this conversation, but okay. Apparently we've experienced a bit of a coup d'etat. Allow me to scroll to that section.
It's the chat energy.
Yeah. So this 1776 commission was released by the White House. It has a nice little logo on the top page.
The only thing that's enjoyable about this is the artwork, and it takes a lot for me to look at an academic paper and go, "Ooh, pretty pictures."
Yeah, that's the big break. What you come away with by the end of it is like, they got good quality pictures in it.
That's a very nice photo of Frederick Douglass.
But yeah, so this was released in like the last few days of the Trump presidency. They really rushed to get this out before Biden came in, and it's basically a response to the 1619 Project, released a little more than a year ago, I'd say, by the New York Times. Essentially, the 1619 Project was an attempt to reevaluate American history, re-go through American history, this time taking as its premise that the country was thematically, not literally, founded in 1619 with the first importation of a black slave. And the reason I stress the literally versus thematically is because some people were confused about this and disregarded the whole project out of hand because, I mean, America was obviously founded in 1776 with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. What kind of moron would think that importing a slave is any valid means of establishing a country?
It's almost like that Monty Python bit, right? The peasant in the field.
The peasant on the podcast in this case.
And it's the anarcho-monarchist peasant. What a goat.
And so, yeah, the 1619 Project was in turn going in a long tradition of activist history, I think would be the best way to put it. The idea being that history should serve more than just a description of the past. It should be used to inform the present and maybe even inspire change in the present. And this method of doing history, this method of writing and disseminating history is largely championed, or most famously championed, by the late historian Howard Zinn, who wrote in 1980 The People's History of the United States, which was meant to serve that purpose, essentially. He'd lived through, he fought in World War II as a bomber, saw the devastation that committed, was largely, that turned him towards the left. And then through the 50s and 60s, he participated in the civil rights movement and came to realize that history, or came to believe that history had a muting effect on social change, that people would, because they looked so aspirationally towards the past rather than taking a more critical look towards it, they kind of were more forgiving. And he felt that in order to encourage people to want to change the present, to change the status quo, they needed to show that the past was not aspirational, and that a new path was needed. That the status quo established in the past was a problematic one, and if we continue to experience it, it continues to be problematic. So we need to shift it. Understandably, those who like the status quo, those who like looking towards the past, those who like to conserve structures, namely conservatives, took huge issue with Howard Zinn, and later took huge issue with the 1619 Project. And so there have been a number of attempts to take down Howard Zinn, a number of attempts to take down popular history of the people's history of the United States. Sorry, there were congressional hearings. There were hearings on how to transform history so that it could inspire more patriotic individuals, and this culminated in the 1776 report. The 1776 report is the latest iteration of this trend, and is more specifically in response to 1619, but there's this kind of long history of this happening, which kind of gives, I think, some hint into the implicit goals that they had when they were writing this. But yeah, anything you two have to say with regards to the question?
Yeah, I mean, I know Zinn at the time was considered by some of his peers and by some of the people in Congress as a revisionist, and I don't necessarily like. I've never read his work directly, but I've read commentaries on it, so I can't speak too much to it. But I know that I don't agree with a lot of what he's getting at, but it's still valuable work, and I don't think it should be discredited just because I don't like I don't like what he has to say. Type of I don't think that attitude is productive at all.
Yeah, he is explicitly a revisionist history. He wears that title.
Oh, I know. It's just it's just I don't think that. I think it's more of you call someone a dog enough, they're just like, fine, I'll wear it, I'll wear it with pride, so I don't know if it's that, but I don't know if it's a good label to hang around his neck, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and actually to go into his work maybe a bit more, his explicit thesis, as might be obvious from the title, People's History of the United States, is history is more valuably told from the perspective of the 99%. So he explicitly issued narratives about presidents and congresses and legislations and generals to the upper echelons of society, and focused more on the trials and struggles and various oppressions of the 99%. And that's where he wears his badge of revisionism proudly. He says, yet these were stories that weren't being told, and I revise history to include these stories. And I think that that's a worthy endeavor. Project 1619 kind of follows in that tradition by saying we're rewriting history from a more racial perspective, because we believe that that is a more important theme than themes of
class structure or strata.
Yeah, or as the 1776 report would put it, narratives of universal truth and God's hand on earth.
Please don't. We're not here to talk about that. We can talk about that later.
Right.
We're not here to talk about the 1776 report, actually.
Oh. You guys are gonna raise my blood pressure to such dangerous levels. You know that, right?
Okay. Let's lower it back down a little bit. I think with regards to both projects like the 1619 Project and Howard Zinn's work, the way I've always understood it at least, is not as necessarily replacing pre-existing history, in so much as it's an attempt to like complement or expand the bounds of existing history. And I know that at least with regards to Zinn, that's when it's most useful. It's when it's used in conjunction necessarily with a standard textbook. just because then you can, like, it gives you a good insight not only into the events of the past, like into the history itself, but also into the processes that go into, you know, determining what is history, what isn't history, and how that's written. So, you know, it really peels away this idea, which many people I think have, where, you know, history is a very set list of things which happened in a certain order, and, you know, some causality was thrown in there, when, you know, there's actually a lot of selection that goes into it. There's a lot of processes that go into informing, you know, what is written about, what isn't written about. So yeah, as you can tell, I never understood much of the frothing at the mouth that goes on about these sorts of things. But
It's it. If you'll allow me, it's also the time that we learned and the people who we were taught by and the society we grew up in. It's very different from the people that would have been reading. I hesitate to do this, but it's almost as reading in the 80s. It would have been like well, it shouldn't have been, but it would have been like reading what's his name, evolution guy. I cannot believe I'm
Charles Darwin.
Thank you. I cannot believe that. It's almost like reading Charles Darwin for the first time in the 1880s. It would 1870s. It would have been this complete sweeping change that even if smart people read it, they would look at it and be like, it's completely irrelevant to me. But I also think Zinn made the smart idea of focusing on the United States, because I think North American countries the Americas countries have an advantage over trying to do something like that in, say, Britain. We have writings from people in the lowest levels of society, from what you could describe as the founding all the way to now. We have their perspective. We're not trying to parcel it out from something a rich landowner wrote in 1311.
Right. Kind of bouncing off that, Howard Zinn is part of, or is at least considered to be a part of, these things get kind of vague. There's lots of infighting. The left is a mess. But he's considered to be a part of the New Left movement, which was also big in Britain, and I think to an extent France. That gave us such historians as E.P. Thompson, Georges Roudet, Eric Hobsbawm, and the like, who also wrote on, not in like quite an expansive way as Howard Zinn did. I don't think any of them tried to do like such a global history. Eric Hobsbawm did like a 3-volume history of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, and that's the closest thing to what Howard Zinn does, where he does this massive history of the entirety of the United States, which poses its own problems. But yeah, so there was this larger movement of trying to bring a more social historical orientation towards popular history, and kind of going off what Zach just said, where it serves better as a complement. I'm pretty sure he explicitly says that in his introduction. I can't be sure because I lent my copy to my sister. So I don't have it with me. And it was very annoying to find out because I wanted to have that quote. But that is, I think I would agree with you, that is the best way to read Zinn, or to read anything that takes a more social historical approach, such as Project 1619. It's best to have a working understanding of the political history, of the general history already, and then to complement it with these. In fact, I think it's an incredibly important thing to have. I strongly encourage that kind of pairing. One of the things that I took most issue with in the 1776 report, to kind of foreshadow later discussion, is the fact that they kind of whitewash, maybe isn't the best word. They
gloss over,
obfuscate, I think might be the best word. All the dirty parts of American history, they still tacitly acknowledge them. They'll say like, yes, we made some mistakes. Slavery was bad. Jim Crow was bad, but America generally gets better every time. And I think that kind of rhetoric gets challenged if you have something like A People's History, which goes into explicit detail of what it means for a country to maintain slavery for 80 years and what that does to, say, the specific slaves, and how their lives, how they weren't just twiddling their thumbs waiting for freedom. Like, there was actual consequences to these things, to these political actions.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's just this report pissed me off so much, and one of the things that really irritated me about it, and you know what, that's a really good point about having a working understanding of at least the concepts of it, and that's something I want to. The people that know us will know this going in, but you know, there's some people I know that don't know you two. There's some people that you guys know that don't know me. So
And hopefully we have a wide audience of people who don't know any of us.
hopefully at some point, but all three of us have varying political views and ideas as to what the state should be and what history should be. It's not that we're all diametrically opposed to each other, but we have different understandings, and that's something that made me really laugh when we read this when we read this this paper and we discussed it for the first time. I heard the audible sigh of relief that came from Cain. The first thing out of my mouth was, "Wow, this was a giant piece of shit."
I was very happy that we all agreed this was terrible, because it would be very hard to have a conversation with one of us liking this, because my part of that conversation would literally just be why, what do you find redeemable in this?
Join us next week for a bonus.
One thing.
Join us next week for a bonus episode in which Cain repeats the word "how" for an hour and a half, nonstop.
I read half a sentence of this report and stop and go, why?
Not even the first sentence, and you just pick one.
Learn the words of interrogation with Cain Dorper. How? Why? What do you mean? How could this be? What?
What is wrong with you?
The amount of notes that I have that end with multiple question marks on this text, and I have like multiple notes per page on this thing. This thing goes for 45 pages. It took me 3 days to get through.
I didn't even get through the appendices.
You saved yourself quite a lot of trouble.
They were useful in a pedagogical sense.
Okay.
So if you wanted to make no, they're not useful if you want to make a curriculum. They're useful if you want to know how to not make a curriculum, but they think they're useful in a way of how to make a curriculum. But yeah. No, that's the end. No, I don't have any.
that is the end of your thoughts. If I may make a comment on, and I am not kidding when I say this is literally the second paragraph, which Cain had previously read almost the entirety of. The sentence, "This requires a restoration of American education, which can only be grounded on a history of those principles that is accurate, honest, unifying, inspiring, and ennobling." I just want to know if there was ever at any point did the idea pop into the author or authors' head that these might be contradictory? Like, how do you want to have a history of slavery which is both accurate and honest to the hardship that was experienced by the slaves, but that is at the same time unifying, inspiring, and ennobling, right? Like, it seems to me that at its very outset, paragraph 2, we have these great contradictions, or this great potential for contradiction, which is just completely unaddressed, like completely glossed over, and I'm certain that if it was a thought, it was an afterthought. It's quite remarkable to me.
I don't know if this is my peanut brain coming through, but I get the idea what they're going for. It's just horrible. It's so badly executed. And that's what really irritates me, because I want to like the idea that this is putting out there. If you take the 1776 Commission paper, I don't know what else to call it, an abomination.
They call it a report.
I'm fully willing to say it irritates myself for very different reasons than it would irritate you guys. It irritates me because it has a good idea of refuting something that a lot of people had issues with, that being the 1619 Project. And I don't think anyone is going to read the 1619 Project and go, there's nothing wrong with this. I don't think anyone's going to do that. I don't even think the authors would read it and say this is a perfect piece of work. But that's fine. That's the nature of this business, and that's okay. But what really friggin' irritates me is that they had this opportunity to come out and say, you know what, America has some dirty fucking skeletons in the closet. We have a lot of dirty laundry that needs to be cleaned and aired out in public for everyone to see. And we need to have these big boy conversations. We need to have these adult conversations and say, you know what, Our past was absolutely shit, and we are dealing with it. That is okay. You're allowed to have a bad past. You're allowed to look at this and say, you know what? We learned from this. We learned how absolutely fucking horrible this situation was, and we want to make ourselves better because of it. It's not fucking acceptable to then go and say, you know what? It was bad, but no, that's not fucking acceptable. You need to you need to pull your pants up, say, yes, our country was a piece of shit. I am not a piece of shit. Therefore, I am going to work to make sure that we don't repeat these mistakes again, and that our society understands the gravity of the situation we're in because of those mistakes. Now, I'm not saying that the generations of now are responsible for slavery. That's not my point. I am so opposed to that logic. My big point here is that there needs to be an acceptance of the pain that was felt for generations. And whether you think it's justified or not, there are people that believe that still feel that pain today. And that needs to be discussed one way or another. It doesn't matter if you might think it's dumb or it's irrelevant. It still needs to be discussed because these are people feel this.
Yeah.
God.
And kind of connecting
Damn.
your 2 points together with Zach's contradictory goals and the rant we just witnessed.
I'm sorry. I am really sorry.
The very valid rant. In something I read earlier about the goals of the paper, the declared purpose of the president's advisory, blah, 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 is to enable a rising generation to understand the history and principles of the founding of the United States in 1776 and to strive to form a more perfect union, which I don't think is necessarily contradictory with your goals. If you want to strive to make a more perfect union, if that is truly your explicit goal, the best way to do that is to get your skeletons with their dirty laundry. I can't quite remember what you said.
Air out the dirty laundry.
Air out the dirty skeletons.
There were a lot of metaphors collided in a very, very brief time period. It was remarkable to witness.
And come to terms with them. Recognize that bad things happened. That bad things are happening. That bad things are happening as a response to the bad things that happened.
It doesn't make you weak to say, you know what happened 100 years ago? That was fucked up. That doesn't make you weak. It doesn't mean that because some shitty things happen, doesn't mean you can't celebrate the great things that the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, even Germany, and any of these countries have done. Just because something shitty happened in the past doesn't mean that you can't look at the great achievements of today, yesterday, or 100 years ago.
And this thing as a response to 1619 also fails remarkably. I haven't had the opportunity to read the 1619 report in full. I've only touched on it in a few classes, but I have listened to the podcast. And the first, so to give a bit more context on the report, so whereas the Project 1619 roots the founding of the United States in the thematic founding of the United States in the importation of the first slave in 1619, the 1776 Commission roots its founding of the United States in the signing of the Declaration of Independence in, you guessed it, 1776.
Damn, didn't see that coming.
And it roots it in these grandiose Enlightenment era goals, missions, attributions about universal rights and equality before the law, and etc. You know all the platitudes, I'm sure. Man, what was I gonna say?
I mean, if you don't know where you're gonna go with that, I do have a point I could build on that with.
Founding 1776. God damn it.
I thought you were about to say, if you don't know where you're going with that, I do. And you were just about to start talking. That would have been the Chad energy we expect.
I mean, I almost did it.
No, where it fails. So 1619, the very first episode, it's open. I can't remember if it's its opening bit, but somewhat in the first episode, it directly renders problematic this idea by stating that Thomas Jefferson, as he was putting the ink, the ink on his quill onto the parchment of the Declaration of Independence, was being waited upon by a slave. There was a slave in the room as he wrote We hold these truths to be self-evident. And it's just not engaging with the slave question or obfuscating it the way they do, because they do technically, if you wanted to put points on the board, they did technically deal with slavery.
I should have had a chalkboard for this.
They just said that their official denunciation of it, or their official explanation of it, waving away of it, was that the Declaration of Independence planted the seeds for emancipation. That Thomas Jefferson was playing 3D chess.
He was playing 7D chess.
Everyone else was too small-brained. They didn't have any idea of he was doing Inception, but with a piece of paper. He didn't even need to go into your dreams to get it done. He just wrote that sentence there, and boom, slavery demolished 80 years later after a brutal civil war.
Now that's Chad energy right there.
But of course, like that also, just within its own, on any understanding of the life of Thomas Jefferson, that falls flat on its face. There are descendants of Thomas Jefferson that exist right now. Some of them are also descendants of one of his slaves, which raises issues. They talk about how the founding fathers all actually secretly hated slavery, but none of them got rid of their slaves.
Some of them did. I'm not defending the 1776 commission here, but some of them did.
In the text, they list. They don't talk about Thomas Jefferson because he never did it.
No.
And they talk about George Washington, who only did it after he wrung out every last cent that he could get out of them, which is to say, he freed them on his deathbed.
Basically, yes. I'm not denying that. I'm not denying that. But there are some that did. And forgive me, I'm a bad researcher. I cannot remember their names, and that irritates me. But again, this brings up one of the many problems I have with this document. What the hell? Like, what the hell? I understand why they use George Washington as their example. He's this mythical figure, and then again, as you said, they conveniently left out the fact that he was dying when he did it. But why? Why? But why though? Why? What? Again, I understand the point of this document. I'm not going to go into that because I know that's one of the talking points you have. I don't get it.
At this point, like, we've already touched on like half the questions I have. We might as well just go into it.
Okay.
There is no order, only anarchy.
This is just chaos.
It would drive the authors of this document insane.
As it should.
Actually, we've kind of touched on one of the questions I have, which I've repeatedly put in my research notes on this, is who is this for? This clearly isn't for people who want to disagree with it. Or maybe it is because it's so easy to do. But like, this clearly isn't meant to face opposition. I can't feel like this is for people who agree with it because it's not interesting enough. It doesn't contribute to the conversation whatsoever.
I was ruminating on this question before, and I was actually sitting on my desk and I almost like smashed my face into my keyboard because it hit me. It hit me. I know what this is for. No, it should have, but it didn't. You guys, full disclosure for all 4 people listening, we had a discussion last night about how we wanted this to work, and we were talking about
this.
No. And we were talking about this exact question, like what the hell is this intended to do? And Cain, or I don't remember, it might have been Zach, and I apologize if I'm mixing up who it was. You guys said, "Oh, you're pretty sure it was for textbook creation," which the appendices points to that. I know I didn't read them, but I read the first one. It was basically just an excerpt of the Constitution. I'm like, bah, been there, done that. It hit me.
Declaration of Independence.
It was the Declaration.
It was.
I'm sorry, I don't speak American. It hit me. This isn't just justification for school systems. This is justification for lawmakers and judges.
You think so?
I think so. Because now they might not be able to use this to back legislation, but they can use it to back actions. follow me on this one. I'm about to go QAnon tinfoil hat. I just got myself put on a list.
The buzzword quota has been reached.
No, I just mean it's very easy now for I'm not going to say which side of the House lawmakers to, because it could be any one of them, to stand up and say in either the Senate, the House, a state legislature, it doesn't matter, for them to stand up and say oppose some sort of declaration, excuse me, bill that would, you know, make whatever. I'm blanking on how I want to say this, and I don't want to say it badly, so I'm not going to. But they can use this to justify
It's like the report.
Yeah, they can use this to justify a position that wouldn't necessarily have any backing behind it, where they could point to, like they need something where they can point to and say, ah, yes, there is my position. You guys following me on that? That like it makes sense. They have like now there is an official government document where a lawmaker can stand up in an assembly in the United States and say, I have the backing of the federal government because that's what this document says. And it's just vague enough while being pointed enough that you can pretty much get whatever the hell you want out of it, as long as you're following, as we're talking about in a little bit, I'm sure, the straight line of history.
Yeah. I think there's something to be said for this creating a line that certain individuals within the American system now need to toe as to what is what is history. To give an example of a time I wrote, who is this written for? I'm omitting all the expletives. One of the quotes they put in here is on page 12, quote, progressives believe that America's original software, the founding documents, were no longer capable of operating America's vastly more complex hardware, the advanced industrial society that had emerged since the founding. Who does that language relate to? Who's like, oh, I have no idea who in America, because again, we got to presume this is mostly an American audience that's meant to be, because no one else exists.
While 3 Canadians comment on it.
Most American, what percentage of Americans are more familiar with the differences of software and hardware and not founding documents and the advanced industrial society that had emerged since the founding? That seems far more easier to parse than this random metaphor you're insisting on.
And the worst part is that's a really good argument, but it's horribly written and it just ruins it.
Yeah, it just makes it less clear.
Yeah, like how hard is it to say that the documents aren't the documents aren't as outdated. Got it. The documents aren't as outdated as people think they are. How hard is it to say that? How hard is it to just they're still relevant because our laws are based on them. How hard is it to say that?
Right. And actually, I'm going to use that opportunity to jump off into another point that I had a lot written for, because we have been kind of circling around less thematic issues and more, this is very badly written, although we have brought up some history issues. And I cannot stress how poorly written this is. I've written a fair few history essays in my time. I've also write for a blog, for a museum. I also just write for fun sometimes. I'm sure both of you have also written more essays than you'd care to think about.
I write for a history channel, man. Come on.
You also write scripts, and like the first rule of halfway competent writing is nail the first line. You have to have the hook, otherwise it goes nowhere. And believe it or not, on top of sentence after sentence after paragraph of bungled sentence crap, they screwed up the first sentence. It's this bloated, I can't say incoherent because it is coherent, but it's bloated.
Can you say that again? I think the sun, and it's nighttime. I think the sun was in my ears. Did you call this coherent?
The first sentence. Not the whole thing.
Okay. Okay. I felt the palpitations starting.
To quote them, and this is one of the things where it took me 10 times to get through it. I would read the first sentence and just leave so exasperated and have to come back to it. But the sentence goes, in the course of human events, there have always been those who deny or reject human freedom, but Americans will never falter in defending the fundamental truths of human liberty proclaimed on July 4th, 1776. And then the following sentence is, we will and we must always hold these truths. Now, not only is this poorly written, it's so superficially written that you can see immediately what they were doing. They're like, oh, the Declaration of Independence is the founding document of the United States of America. That's the thesis of this piece, so we need to use the same words that are in it. But they already had the sentence written. There have always been those who deny or reject human freedom, etc. So they just took some of the starting words of the Declaration of Independence, tacked it on right on the front, said, yeah, it's fine. No worries, it's good. And then they followed it up with this weird law of physics that they've decided on, where Americans never falter in defending the fundamental truths of human liberty. That's just a rule. You can't be American if you don't do that, or you stop being American if you do that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure on the exact mechanism of how this law applies itself. It's bewildering because it gets worse from there.
I have my favorite quote locked up, ready to go.
By all means, read it.
But before it just hit me how this is written. This is written by those edgy meme lords or edgy 16-year-old girls, and I say that specifically. You know who you are. None of you are listening to this. Where they write something they think is so deep and so impactful and so meaningful, when really it belongs in the back of a cereal box because only a toddler would understand it.
So, post-production Ryan here. This took a lot longer than we expected, so we're going to have to cut it in half here. And if you want to find out what the rest of this train arc was going to be like, because let me tell you, it's worth tuning in for, you're going to have to come back next week. See you then.